Hello again. My name is Mariah Wells, and I am here to discuss with you about the nature of capital punishment and what it's doing to our society. I have come with degrees in sociology and law and justice, and I've had time in the field, and I've been able to really reflect on why the death penalty needs to be abolished in this country, or at least we need to take a step back and think about if the person that we're executing is actually guilty. So, my reasons for abolishing capital punishment aren't necessarily the morality, aren't necessarily being not tough on crime, but it's important that we know whether or not the person actually committed the crime. It's costing our state and our government way too much money to house these people through the appeal process, and the prisoners themselves are suffering from severe mental health crises that may or may not even render them able to be executed, because you must be of a sound mind. I will be discussing with you the nature of capital punishment, so the process from trial to execution, and then I'm going to explain why I feel that this is wrong and maybe what we could do to fix it as a society. So, I'm going to be speaking on Washington State because this is where I'm from. Now, in other states, the capital punishment laws might be a little bit different, but the process is basically the same. So, in order to be even considered for the death penalty in Washington State, you must have committed aggravated first-degree murder, which states that you needed to commit another felony, or there was a victim that may be dependent upon you, like a child or a disabled person. You killed someone that was a law enforcement officer, or you kidnapped a person and then you killed them. That's the nature of what aggravating factors are. Another aggravating factor would be if you're out on parole, so you're released from prison and you're on community supervision. Those are the only crimes that you could be tried for and get the death penalty in Washington State. So once the defendant is charged, they go through their typical trial and the jury finds them guilty or not guilty. You must have a unanimous vote, 12 guilty, the person is convicted. Then it goes on into the penalty phase, which is different from a regular trial where the judge just sentences them. The juries must weigh whether or not the defendant has any mitigating or aggravating factors. So an aggravating factor might be that they're a career criminal, or a mitigating factor might be that they have some sort of mental illness, or they might not have the highest IQ, or they were abused during their childhood. These are all mitigating factors, and juries must decide whether or not these mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors, therefore sparing the defendant's life or not. Typically, what will happen if they find that mitigating factors outweigh, the defendant will be sentenced to life without parole, and that's it. Or if they find that the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors, then they will be given the death penalty. In Washington State, they're sent to the Washington State Penitentiary if they're a man, or the Washington Corrections Center for women if they're a woman. From there, they'll be housed in a solitary confinement area, or death row if you are a male. Women don't really have a death row because there has never been a woman executed in Washington State, according to the Department of Corrections, and there has never been a death row for women, according to the DOC. So men are housed at the Walla Prison, or the Washington State Penitentiary, and they will sit on death row in a single cell for about 12 years. Sometimes longer, sometimes not as long if they volunteer to be executed. This is a time where the defendant can decide to get his appeals through, so they have the opportunity to appeal to all of the courts to decide whether or not they got a fair trial, or if there's some piece of evidence that maybe wasn't heard at trial that would have changed their conviction. So they have that opportunity to do that. If all appeals fail, they will be given an execution date and they will be sent to the execution chamber. Now, for most states, lethal injection is the only method that is used. But in Washington State, we're a little bit different. Hanging is another form of execution that the state has decided is constitutional. So prisoners may choose to be hanged if they would like. Now, when someone is executed, it's a very sad thing. You know, someone is dying, that man has a family, that man has, maybe a wife and children, maybe, parents, and we still have to lay someone to rest. So the system that they go through, from death watch to, the execution chamber or the gallows, is all systematic, and it can be traumatizing, especially if they get a last-minute stay of execution, which means that they won't be executed that night. Staying for 23 hours a day by yourself in a single cell is, it can be very detrimental to your mental health. A source book on solitary confinement discusses the need for prisoners to be having human interactions, even if they are dangerous criminals. And what we see is that on death row after death row, these men are not getting the opportunity to socialize with other human beings, and it's making them depressed, and it's making them want to commit suicide or even have a psychotic breakdown. The 8th Amendment of the Constitution states that we cannot have cruel and unusual punishment. And to me, if we are sending prisoners to death row and we're leaving them there for 14 years alone in solitary confinement, and they have limited human interaction, we are making them psychotic, and then we're executing them, which is contrary to what our Constitution says we should be doing. Mental health, you cannot be executed if you're mentally ill. Another thing that we need to take into consideration as a nation is whether or not the death penalty is worth it. On average, it costs the state $125,000 to house an inmate for 30 years, where appeals and death penalty litigation cost the state millions of dollars. In California, it was stated that they spend $75 million on appeals for inmates on death row. And that is a big savings if we abolish it, because we don't have to worry about any more appeals. The other thing that's troubling about the death penalty is sometimes we don't even know if the people we're executing are truly guilty. And even those that support the death penalty, according to Deadline, the documentary, say that they aren't for executing an innocent person. I don't think anyone is. So the best way to avoid executing innocent people is to give everyone life without parole. That way, if we make a mistake, we can let them out of prison. We can't resurrect someone from the grave and expect them to be okay. So, in short, capital punishment is detrimental for our society. We are spending way too much money housing inmates and spending money on their appeals. We are causing undue mental stress on the condemned man or woman. And finally, we don't even know if we're getting the right person. We've exonerated 134 people from death row just in the past 10 years. And to me, that's 134 too many. We don't know how many innocent people have been executed. The best solution for our country at this point in time is to immediately call for a moratorium on the death penalty and sentence all inmates convicted of aggravated first-degree murder or the equivalent to life without parole. Thank you.